In the shadowed corridors of the Medici Palace, where power was currency and influence the only true wealth, a young diplomat named Lorenzo watched as his mentor conducted what would become one of history's most brilliant displays of strategic scarcity. The year was 1512, and the French had just been expelled from Milan. Every noble in Italy sought audience with Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, soon to become Pope Leo X, believing their moment of opportunity had arrived. Yet the cardinal received none of them. For 3 weeks, Lorenzo witnessed petitioners arrive with gifts of gold, promises of alliance, and desperate pleas for mere moments of the cardinal's time. Dukes who commanded armies waited in antechambers like supplicants. Merchants who could buy kingdoms found their purses suddenly worthless. The more the cardinal withdrew, the more desperately they sought him. The more he refused their offerings, the more valuable his eventual attention became. Power, the cardinal explained to Lorenzo one evening as they walked through the palace gardens, is not what you possess, but what others believe you possess. And belief is cultivated through absence, not presence. This principle, observed in the crucible of Renaissance politics, reveals the fundamental truth that would later echo through every corridor of power, every marketplace of desire, and every arena of human ambition: scarcity creates value, and value commands attention. But, more than creating external worth, scarcity transforms the very essence of the person who wields it. It becomes the alchemical process by which the ordinary self is destroyed and the unforgettable self is born. The weak self, the desperate, seeking, always available version of ourselves, operates from a paradigm of abundance in all the wrong ways. It believes that being present everywhere, available to everyone, accommodating to all requests, somehow increases its value in the world. This weak self accepts every invitation, responds to every message immediately, and makes itself a known quantity in every interaction. It broadcasts its thoughts on every platform, shares its resources freely, and presents itself as an open book to be read by anyone with passing interest. But, in this very openness, this very availability, lies its destruction. Not by others, but by its own hand. The weak self dissolves into the background noise of existence because it fails to understand the fundamental law of human psychology: we desire what we cannot easily have, and we dismiss what comes too readily to hand. The transformation begins with a revelation that strikes like lightning through consciousness, the recognition that your current self, with all its eager accommodations, its desperate need for approval, its constant availability, is not your true self at all, but merely a collection of conditioned responses to the demands of a world that has taught you to believe your worth comes from external validation. This weak self must be systematically dismantled, not through violence or sudden dramatic gesture, but through the careful application of strategic withdrawal. Consider Marcus, a brilliant software engineer who found himself perpetually overlooked despite his exceptional skills. He made himself available for every project, worked weekends without being asked, and responded to messages within minutes regardless of the hour. His colleagues took his availability for granted, his managers assigned him work without considering his capacity, and his innovations were credited to others who positioned themselves more strategically. Marcus was invisible precisely because he was everywhere. The transformation required Marcus to recognize that his weak self, the self that said yes to everything, that made itself indispensable through constant availability, was actually making him dispensable through its very eagerness. He began to implement what became his personal doctrine of strategic scarcity. He stopped responding to messages immediately, instead waiting for optimal timing. He declined meetings that didn't serve his strategic objectives. He made his expertise available only when the terms met his standards. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, his time became valuable because it was limited. His opinions carried weight because they were not freely distributed. His presence at meetings became sought after because it could not be assumed. Within 6 months, Marcus had transformed from an invisible contributor to an indispensable strategist, receiving job offers that tripled his salary and recognition that had previously eluded him entirely. This transformation illustrates the first principle of Machiavellian scarcity, the destruction of the weak self through strategic withdrawal. But this destruction is not mere absence, it is calculated presence. The master of scarcity does not simply disappear, they appear at precisely the right moment, in exactly the right context, with maximum impact. The weak self operates from scarcity of confidence and abundance of availability. The transformed self operates from abundance of confidence and scarcity of availability. This reversal creates what psychologists call the scarcity effect, the tendency for reduced availability to increase desirability. But, more than this, it creates internal transformation. When you stop making yourself available to everything, you begin to become available to yourself. When you stop seeking validation from everyone, you begin to discover your own intrinsic worth. Isabella learned this principle in the art world, where her paintings were initially dismissed by galleries despite their obvious quality. She had made the mistake of the weak self, showing her work to anyone who would look, accepting any exhibition opportunity, and pricing her pieces to sell rather than to reflect their value. Her desperation to be seen had made her invisible. The turning point came when Isabella made a decision that terrified her weak self but liberated her true self. She withdrew her work from every accessible venue and began showing only to carefully selected collectors, and only by private appointment. She raised her prices dramatically and refused to explain or justify her artistic choices to anyone who questioned them. She created mystery around her process, working in a studio that no one was permitted to enter uninvited. The transformation was profound. Suddenly, viewing Isabella's work became a privilege rather than a casual encounter. Her paintings acquired an aura of exclusivity that had nothing to do with their inherent quality and everything to do with their scarcity. Collectors began competing for pieces they might previously have overlooked. Gallery owners who had once dismissed her work now sought her out, offering representation on her terms rather than theirs. But the most important transformation was internal. Isabella discovered that when she stopped seeking validation from the art world, she began creating work that truly reflected her vision rather than her perception of what others wanted to see. The destruction of her weak, approval-seeking self had liberated her authentic artistic voice. This principle extends far beyond individual advancement to encompass the very nature of memorable presence in the world. The unforgettable individual understands that memory is selective, and what is always present soon becomes part of the invisible background of existence. We remember the sunset precisely because it appears once each day and disappears completely. We treasure the rare flower because we cannot have it whenever we wish. We value the wise counsel of the mentor who speaks little but says much when they do speak. The weak self believes that constant communication strengthens relationships, that immediate availability demonstrates care, that being indispensable through overwork creates security. But each of these beliefs leads to its opposite outcome. Constant communication creates noise that drowns out meaningful connection. Immediate availability teaches others that your time has no value. Being indispensable through overwork makes you a utility rather than a partner. The architecture of scarcity requires careful construction. It begins with the recognition that your attention, your time, your expertise, your presence, and your approval are finite resources that should be allocated with the same strategic consideration that a master investor applies to a portfolio. Every yes to one opportunity is a no to another. Every moment given to one person is a moment withheld from someone else. Every expenditure of energy in one direction is energy unavailable for another purpose. But this recognition alone is insufficient. The weak self might understand these principles intellectually while still failing to implement them emotionally. The transformation requires what might be called strategic ruthlessness, the willingness to disappoint some people in order to become invaluable to the right people. It requires accepting that not everyone will understand or appreciate your selective availability, and that this misunderstanding is not a problem to be solved but a feature of the system working correctly. The master of strategic scarcity understands that there are 3 levels of withdrawal that create ascending levels of impact. The first level is temporal scarcity, controlling when you are available. The second level is selective scarcity, controlling to whom you are available. The third level is qualitative scarcity, controlling what aspects of yourself you make available. Temporal scarcity involves creating rhythms of presence and absence that generate anticipation and appreciation. This might mean establishing specific hours when you are reachable and maintaining absolute boundaries around those times. It might mean creating delays between stimulus and response that allow you to craft thoughtful rather than reactive communications. It might mean establishing patterns of engagement that train others to value your time appropriately. Selective scarcity involves choosing your audience with the same care that a luxury brand chooses its customers. Not everyone deserves access to your expertise, your attention, or your energy. The weak self believes in democratic availability, that fairness requires equal access for all. The transformed self understands that your highest contribution comes from focusing your resources on the people and opportunities that can best utilize and appreciate what you offer. Qualitative scarcity involves controlling which aspects of your knowledge, skills, and personality you reveal in different contexts. The weak self overshares, believing that transparency creates connection and trust. The transformed self understands that mystery creates intrigue, that partial revelation generates desire for complete understanding, and that holding back certain aspects of yourself makes the aspects you do share more valuable. These three levels work synergistically to create what might be called presence amplification, the ability to have greater impact through strategic limitation than through unlimited availability. When you control your temporal availability, people learn to prepare for interactions with you rather than assuming they can capture your attention casually. When you practice selective availability, those who do have access understand that they are part of a chosen group. When you maintain qualitative scarcity, every revelation becomes significant because it adds to a carefully curated understanding of who you are. The weak self fears that implementing these strategies will lead to isolation, rejection, or missed opportunities. But experience reveals the opposite. Strategic scarcity creates a gravitational field around you that draws the right opportunities and people while naturally filtering out those who would waste your resources or fail to appreciate your value. Consider the phenomenon of the exclusive restaurant that maintains a reservation list months long despite having empty tables on any given night. The scarcity is often artificial, they could serve more customers if they chose to, but the limitation creates value that extends far beyond the quality of the food. Diners treasure their reservations, approach the meal with heightened anticipation, and remember the experience more vividly because of its exclusivity. The same principle applies to human relationships and professional opportunities. When your availability becomes scarce, people approach interactions with you differently. They prepare more thoroughly, communicate more clearly, and value the time more highly. This changed dynamic elevates the quality of every interaction, creating a positive feedback loop that reinforces your position as someone whose time and attention are valuable. But the most profound transformation occurs within. When you stop being available to everyone and everything, you become available to yourself in ways that were previously impossible. The constant external noise quiets, allowing you to hear your own thoughts clearly. The pressure to respond immediately to every demand dissolves, creating space for considered responses that reflect your true priorities and values. The destruction of the weak self through strategic scarcity is not a loss but a liberation. You are not becoming less than you were, you are revealing what you have always been beneath the layers of conditioning that taught you to believe your worth came from external validation and constant availability. The unforgettable self that emerges is not constructed but discovered. It was always there, waiting for the weak self to step aside. This process requires patience and faith. The weak self will resist with every strategy at its disposal, generating anxiety about missed opportunities, fear about being forgotten, and doubt about whether you truly deserve the value you are claiming for yourself. These feelings are not problems to be solved but signals that the transformation is working. The weak self only fights this hard when it senses that something fundamental is changing. The key insight that enables persistence through this resistance is understanding that you are not withholding your true self from the world, you are protecting it until you find contexts worthy of its full expression. You are not becoming selfish, you are becoming self-honoring. You are not creating artificial barriers, you are establishing appropriate boundaries that allow your genuine contributions to be recognized and valued. The architecture of scarcity, properly constructed, becomes invisible to its beneficiaries while remaining apparent to its architect. Others experience you as naturally exclusive, genuinely valuable, and appropriately selective without necessarily recognizing the strategic thinking that creates these impressions. This invisibility of method is crucial. The moment others perceive your scarcity as artificial manipulation, its power dissolves. True Machiavellian scarcity operates from authentic principles rather than calculated deception. You are not pretending to be valuable, you are insisting that your actual value be recognized. You are not artificially creating scarcity, you are acknowledging the natural limitations of your time, energy, and attention, and allocating these resources strategically rather than randomly. The unforgettable individual emerges from this process not as someone who has learned to manipulate others, but as someone who has learned to honor themselves. The scarcity you create is not designed to frustrate or control others, but to ensure that when you do engage, you can do so fully, authentically, and at your highest level of contribution. This foundation of strategic scarcity becomes the bedrock upon which all other aspects of memorable presence are built. Without it, charisma becomes neediness, expertise becomes common knowledge, and presence becomes background noise. With it, every aspect of your engagement with the world becomes amplified, focused, and unforgettable. Part 2: The Psychology of Magnetic Withdrawal. The Venetian merchant Prince Antonio Grimani understood something about human nature that escaped his more generous competitors. The relationship between desire and accessibility operates on an inverse curve that defies rational explanation. While other merchants displayed their finest goods prominently, competing for attention through abundance and availability, Grimani kept his most precious items hidden in private chambers, shown only to select clients who had demonstrated both serious intent and substantial means. His competitors mocked this approach, believing that visibility drove sales and that hidden inventory was wasted inventory. They filled their shop windows with silks, spices, and jewels, creating displays designed to attract every passerby. Yet Grimani's private showings generated more revenue in a single afternoon than his competitors achieved in weeks of public display. The whispered rumors about the extraordinary items in his private collection created a mystique that no amount of window dressing could match. The psychology behind this phenomenon reaches deep into the fundamental architecture of human motivation and memory formation. When we encounter something readily available, our minds process it through what psychologists call the availability heuristic. We assume that things we see frequently or access easily are common and, therefore, less valuable. But, when something is scarce or difficult to obtain, our brains interpret this scarcity as a signal of worth, triggering what researchers have identified as the scarcity principle of influence. But, the psychology of magnetic withdrawal operates on levels far more sophisticated than simple supply and demand economics. At its deepest level, it manipulates the very mechanisms by which human beings form memories, create emotional attachments, and assign meaning to experiences. The unforgettable individual understands these mechanisms and uses them not to deceive, but to ensure that their genuine value is perceived accurately rather than being diluted by overexposure. Consider the neuroscience of memory formation. Our brains are constantly filtering vast amounts of sensory information, retaining only what appears significant, novel, or emotionally charged. The routine, the predictable, the always available gets processed through what neuroscientists call the default mode network, essentially filing it away as background information that requires no special attention or storage. But scarcity triggers different neural pathways entirely. When we encounter something rare or difficult to obtain, our brains activate the same reward circuits that evolved to help our ancestors remember the locations of scarce but vital resources. The anticipation of a rare encounter creates a release of dopamine that not only makes the eventual experience more pleasurable but also ensures that it will be encoded in long-term memory with unusual clarity and emotional intensity. This neurological reality explains why Maria, a consultant who transformed her career by embracing strategic scarcity, found that clients remembered her recommendations months after a single meeting while forgetting the advice of consultants they met with regularly. Maria had learned to limit her availability to 1 day per week for client meetings, spacing appointments to allow deep preparation for each encounter. She declined projects that didn't meet her specific criteria and charged premium rates that reflected the exclusivity of her time. The transformation in client behavior was immediate and revealing. Instead of treating meetings with Maria as routine check-ins, clients began preparing extensively, arriving with carefully thought-out questions and clear objectives. They took detailed notes during meetings and implemented her recommendations with unusual consistency. Most importantly, they remembered her insights and continued to reference them in future decisions long after other consultants' advice had been forgotten. But Maria's transformation extended beyond external client relationships to encompass her own psychological relationship with her work and her identity. When she stopped making herself available to every opportunity, she began experiencing what psychologists call intrinsic motivation, engagement with activities for their inherent satisfaction rather than external validation. Her work quality improved dramatically because she was no longer spreading her attention across too many projects. Her insights became deeper because she had time to think rather than just react. The psychology of magnetic withdrawal creates what might be called a value amplification field around the individual who practices it skillfully. This field operates through several interconnected mechanisms that work together to create an impression of exceptional worth and memorable presence. The first mechanism is anticipation enhancement. When your availability is limited and your presence is not guaranteed, others begin to anticipate interactions with you differently. This anticipation itself becomes a form of engagement that extends far beyond the actual time you spend together. People prepare more thoroughly for meetings with you because they know they may not have another opportunity soon. They pay closer attention during interactions because they cannot assume casual access to your insights. Dr. Sarah Chen discovered this principle when she transformed her medical practice from one focused on maximizing patient volume to one dedicated to providing exceptional care to a carefully selected patient base. Instead of booking appointments every 15 minutes throughout the day, Dr. Chen began scheduling hour-long consultations with significant gaps between appointments, seeing fewer patients but providing each with her complete attention. The change in patient behavior was remarkable. Instead of arriving with hastily written lists of symptoms, patients began keeping detailed health journals in preparation for their appointments. They researched their conditions and came with informed questions rather than expecting Dr. Chen to diagnose issues they could not articulate. Most significantly, they followed her recommendations with unprecedented compliance because they understood that her guidance was not casually given. But the most profound change was in Dr. Chen herself. When she stopped trying to serve everyone, she began serving her patients at a level that tapped into her deepest medical knowledge and intuition. Her diagnostic accuracy improved, her treatment recommendations became more innovative, and her personal satisfaction with her work reached levels she had not experienced since medical school. The second mechanism is exclusivity psychology. Human beings are inherently tribal creatures who derive significant meaning from group membership and social position. When access to you becomes selective, those who do have access automatically become part of an exclusive group. This membership itself becomes valuable, independent of the actual content of the interaction. This principle explains why James, an executive coach who had struggled to differentiate himself in a crowded market, experienced a complete transformation when he began accepting only clients who met specific criteria and were referred by existing clients. By making his services accessible only through referral and by maintaining a waiting list for new clients, James created what economists call signaling value, the worth that comes from association with exclusivity itself. Clients began describing their work with James not just in terms of the insights they gained, but in terms of their membership in his exclusive clientele. They valued the relationship partly because others could not easily access it. This exclusivity psychology created powerful word-of-mouth marketing because clients took pride in their ability to recommend someone who was difficult to work with, meaning selective rather than challenging. The third mechanism is curiosity amplification. When someone is not fully available, not completely transparent, not entirely predictable, they create what psychologists call information gaps that the human mind feels compelled to fill. This curiosity becomes a form of mental engagement that keeps you present in others' thoughts even when you are physically absent. The master of strategic scarcity understands that mystery is more engaging than transparency, that partial revelation creates more interest than complete disclosure. This does not mean being dishonest or manipulative, but rather being selective about what aspects of yourself you reveal in different contexts and to different people. Elena, an artist who had struggled to gain recognition despite exceptional technical skill, discovered this principle when she began limiting access to her studio and process. Instead of posting daily updates about her work on social media and explaining her techniques to anyone who asked, Elena began sharing only finished pieces with minimal explanation. She stopped attending every art opening and began appearing only at carefully selected events where her presence would be noticed and remembered. The shift in perception was dramatic. Instead of being seen as a competent but unremarkable artist, Elena began to be regarded as mysterious and intriguing. gallery owners who had previously ignored her work began asking mutual connections about her background and availability. Collectors started inquiring about pieces they had heard about but not seen. The same work that had been overlooked when freely displayed became sought after when access was restricted. But the most important transformation was in Elena's own relationship with her art. When she stopped explaining her process to everyone who asked, she began to understand it more deeply herself. When she stopped seeking validation for every piece, she began creating work that reflected her authentic vision rather than her perception of what others wanted to see. The fourth mechanism is what might be called effort justification. When people must invest effort to gain access to something, they automatically value the thing more highly than if it had been freely given. This principle explains why exclusive restaurants maintain reservation systems that require advance planning, why luxury brands create barriers to purchase, and why the most memorable teachers are often those whose approval must be earned rather than those who give it freely. The psychology here connects to what researchers call cognitive dissonance theory. When we expend effort to obtain something, our minds must justify that effort by believing the thing obtained is valuable. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where the difficulty of access increases perceived value, which in turn justifies the effort expended to gain access. Marcus learned this principle when he transformed his consulting practice from one that accepted every project to one that required potential clients to complete a detailed assessment process before being considered for engagement. Instead of deterring clients, this requirement actually increased demand for his services. Companies began to value his expertise more highly precisely because it was not easily obtained. The assessment process itself became valuable to clients even before they began working with Marcus. It forced them to think more clearly about their challenges and objectives, creating better outcomes regardless of whether they ultimately engaged his services. But, for those who did complete the process and begin working with Marcus, the initial investment of effort created a psychological commitment that led to better implementation of his recommendations and higher satisfaction with results. The fifth mechanism operates through what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful schedule for creating lasting behavioral patterns. When your presence, approval, or attention is given unpredictably rather than consistently, it creates a psychological dynamic similar to what makes gambling addictive. People become more invested in gaining your positive regard because they cannot predict when it will be available. This principle must be applied with great care and genuine authenticity. The goal is not to manipulate others through artificial unpredictability, but to align your natural rhythms and preferences with strategic timing that maximizes the impact of your engagement. When you do choose to engage fully, the rarity of that full engagement makes it more memorable and meaningful. Dr. Michael Torres, a university professor who had been struggling to engage his students despite his deep knowledge and passion for his subject, discovered this principle when he began varying his availability and teaching style. Instead of maintaining consistent office hours and predictable lecture formats, Dr. Torres began offering spontaneous study sessions for students who demonstrated exceptional engagement, creating special seminars for those who showed particular interest in advanced topics, and providing detailed feedback on assignments for students whose work showed genuine effort while giving minimal feedback to those who submitted perfunctory work. The change in student behavior was remarkable. Instead of taking his availability for granted, students began competing for his attention through the quality of their work and engagement. Class discussions became more dynamic because students knew that exceptional contributions might be rewarded with special opportunities for deeper learning. But the most significant change was in Dr. Torres himself. When he stopped providing equal attention to all students regardless of their effort and engagement, he began to experience the deep satisfaction of teaching at his highest level to students who truly appreciated and could benefit from his expertise. The psychology of magnetic withdrawal creates what might be called a selection pressure that naturally filters your relationships and opportunities toward those that are most mutually beneficial. When you make yourself scarce, only those who genuinely value what you offer will invest the effort required to maintain connection with you. This natural selection process eliminates the energy drain of maintaining relationships with people who take your presence for granted while strengthening connections with those who appreciate your true worth. But, perhaps the most profound aspect of this psychology is its effect on your own self-perception and capabilities. When you stop making yourself available to everyone and everything, you begin to experience yourself differently. The constant external validation seeking that characterized your weak self gives way to an internal sense of worth that is independent of others' opinions or approval. This internal transformation is crucial because authentic magnetic withdrawal cannot be sustained from a place of insecurity or manipulation. It must arise from genuine self-respect and a clear understanding of your own value. When you truly believe that your time, attention, and expertise are valuable resources that should be allocated strategically, your scarcity becomes natural rather than artificial, authentic rather than manipulative. The psychology of magnetic withdrawal thus becomes a tool for personal transformation as much as a strategy for external influence. By withdrawing strategically from situations and relationships that do not honor your worth, you create space for discovering and developing aspects of yourself that may have been dormant or underutilized. The unforgettable self that emerges from this process is not constructed but revealed. It was always there, waiting for the weak self to stop overshadowing it with desperate availability and approval seeking. Part 3, The Alchemy of Controlled Absence. In the winter of 1962, Miles Davis walked off the stage at the Village Vanguard in the middle of a trumpet solo, leaving his band to continue without him while he disappeared into the New York night. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether this was part of the performance or a genuine abandonment. Critics called it unprofessional. Club owners deemed it risky. But that single act of controlled absence became legendary, talked about for decades as an example of artistic integrity that transcended conventional expectations. What Davis understood, perhaps intuitively, was that strategic withdrawal at the moment of highest engagement creates an psychological imprint that mere presence, no matter how brilliant, cannot achieve. The incomplete performance lived in listeners' memories more vividly than countless complete concerts they had forgotten. The absence became the message, more powerful than any note he might have played. This incident illustrates the highest level of mastery in the art of strategic scarcity, the ability to transform absence itself into a form of presence so compelling that it becomes unforgettable. This is the alchemy of controlled absence, the sophisticated practice of using withdrawal not as retreat, but as the ultimate form of engagement. The metaphor of alchemy is precisely appropriate here, for what we are describing is indeed a transformation of base material into gold. The base material is ordinary human attention and availability resources that everyone possesses in roughly equal measure. The gold is memorable impact, lasting influence, and the ability to remain present in others' consciousness even when physically absent. The alchemical process is the strategic application of scarcity to transform common availability into rare and precious presence. Consider the story of Catherine, a marketing executive who discovered this principle during what initially appeared to be a career crisis. After 15 years of making herself indispensable through constant availability, responding to emails within minutes, attending every meeting, accepting every project, Catherine found herself facing burnout while simultaneously being overlooked for promotion. Her immediate impulse was to work even harder, be even more available, make herself even more indispensable. Instead, Catherine made a decision that terrified her weak self. She began systematically withdrawing from the pattern of constant availability that had defined her professional identity. She established specific hours for checking email and communicated those boundaries clearly to colleagues. She declined meeting invitations that did not align with her strategic objectives. Most dramatically, she resigned from 3 high-visibility but ultimately meaningless committees that had been consuming her time without advancing her career. The initial response was exactly what her weak self had feared: confusion, frustration, and criticism from colleagues accustomed to her unlimited availability. But Catherine had studied the principle of controlled absence and understood that this initial resistance was not a sign of failure but evidence that the transformation was working. She maintained her boundaries with polite but absolute consistency, redirecting conversations about her reduced availability to discussions of the quality and impact of her contributions when she was present. Within 6 months, the alchemy began to manifest. Colleagues who had previously taken Catherine's insights for granted began preparing more carefully for interactions with her, knowing they could not assume casual access to her expertise. Her recommendations carried more weight because they came less frequently and were more carefully considered. Most importantly, when Catherine did engage fully with a project or initiative, her focused attention produced results that had been impossible when her energy was scattered across dozens of competing priorities. The promotion that had eluded Catherine during her years of constant availability materialized within 8 months of her embrace of strategic scarcity. But, more significantly, the quality of her work life transformed completely. She began experiencing what she later described as professional presence, the ability to be fully engaged with chosen activities rather than partially present for everything. The alchemy of controlled absence operates through several sophisticated mechanisms that work together to transform ordinary withdrawal into magnetic presence. Understanding these mechanisms is crucial for anyone seeking to master this highest level of strategic scarcity. The first mechanism is what might be called presence intensification. When your availability is limited, your actual presence becomes more concentrated and impactful. Instead of spreading your attention across multiple interactions simultaneously, you can engage with full focus and intensity. This concentrated presence creates more memorable experiences for others than diffused availability ever could. Dr. Jonathan Walsh, a therapist who transformed his practice through controlled absence, discovered this principle when he began seeing fewer clients but dedicating more time and attention to each session. Instead of booking appointments every hour throughout the day, Dr. Walsh began scheduling 90-minute sessions with breaks between clients that allowed him to fully transition his attention and prepare for each encounter. The impact on his therapeutic effectiveness was dramatic. Clients began reporting breakthrough insights and lasting changes after just a few sessions, outcomes that had previously required months of regular meetings. The longer sessions allowed for deeper exploration of issues, while the breaks between clients allowed Dr. Walsh to bring fresh energy and complete attention to each person. But, the most significant change was in Dr. Walsh himself. When he stopped trying to help everyone who sought his services, he began working at a level of therapeutic skill that he had not known he possessed. His intuition sharpened, his interventions became more precise, and his personal satisfaction with his work reached levels that reinvigorated his entire career. The second mechanism is anticipation architecture, the strategic creation of future-focused desire through carefully managed expectations of availability. This involves not just being scarce, but being scarce in patterns that create anticipation and heighten the value of eventual access. Master this requires understanding that human beings are anticipatory creatures who often derive more pleasure from looking forward to experiences than from the experiences themselves. When you create certainty about your eventual availability while maintaining uncertainty about timing, you tap into this psychological reality to remain present in others' thoughts even during periods of absence. Elena, the artist mentioned earlier, refined this principle into what became her signature approach to managing her career. Instead of maintaining unpredictable availability, Elena began announcing specific periods when she would be accessible for studio visits, for interviews, for gallery meetings, while maintaining complete unavailability outside those windows. She might announce that she would be available for studio visits during the third week of each month, taking appointments only during that period while remaining completely unreachable otherwise. This pattern created what Elena called concentrated access, intense periods of engagement surrounded by protective barriers of absence. Gallery owners, collectors, and critics began structuring their schedules around Elena's availability windows, treating appointments during these periods as significant events worthy of careful preparation. The quality of these interactions improved dramatically because everyone involved understood that the opportunity for engagement was limited and valuable. The third mechanism is absence communication, the ability to convey meaning and maintain influence through strategic non-communication. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of controlled absence, requiring mastery of what is not said, not done, and not provided. The weak self believes that more communication strengthens relationships and that silence indicates indifference or hostility. The transformed self understands that selective silence can communicate more powerfully than words, that strategic non-response can generate more engagement than immediate availability, and that well-timed absence can demonstrate more care than constant presence. Consider Robert, a senior executive who transformed his leadership effectiveness through mastery of absence communication. Previously, Robert had believed that good leadership required immediate response to every question, constant availability to team members, and detailed explanations of every decision. His office operated with an open-door policy that left him constantly interrupted and his team increasingly dependent on his immediate input for every minor decision. Robert began implementing what he called leadership scarcity. He established specific windows when he was available for questions and consultation, while maintaining protected time for strategic thinking and planning. More importantly, he began responding to requests with strategic delays that encouraged team members to think through problems independently before seeking his input. The transformation in team dynamics was remarkable. Instead of bringing every minor issue to Robert immediately, team members began working through problems collaboratively, approaching Robert only when they needed genuine leadership input. The quality of questions and conversations improved dramatically because team members knew they would not have immediate access to his guidance and, therefore, prepared more thoroughly. But, the most significant change was in Robert's own leadership capability. When he stopped trying to manage every detail personally, he began seeing strategic patterns and opportunities that had been invisible during his period of constant tactical involvement. His decisions became better informed and more far-reaching because he had created space for the kind of deep thinking that effective leadership requires. The fourth mechanism is return amplification, the strategic management of re-engagement to maximize impact when you do choose to break your absence. This requires understanding that the power of scarcity is ultimately realized not in permanent withdrawal but in the heightened impact of selective return. The master of controlled absence understands that every return from absence is an opportunity to demonstrate their value with maximum clarity and memorability. These moments of re-engagement must be carefully chosen and expertly executed to justify the period of withdrawal that preceded them. Maria, the consultant discussed earlier, developed this into a refined art form. After establishing patterns of selective availability that trained clients to value her time appropriately, Maria began planning her returns from absence to coincide with moments when her expertise could have maximum impact. She would emerge from periods of limited availability with insights that had been developed during her withdrawal, recommendations that reflected deep thinking rather than reactive advice, and perspectives that could only have been gained through strategic distance from daily operational concerns. These moments of return became legendary among Maria's clients. They began referring to Maria moments, occasions when her carefully timed re-engagement shifted the trajectory of important decisions or projects. The combination of her absence sharpened insights and the heightened attention that her scarcity commanded created a powerful synergy that elevated her influence far beyond what constant availability had ever achieved. The fifth mechanism is legacy presence, the ability to remain influential during periods of absence through the lasting impact of previous engagements. This represents the highest level of mastery in controlled absence, where your influence continues to operate even when you are not actively present. Legacy presence requires that your periods of engagement be so memorable, so impactful, and so valuable that they continue to influence decisions and behaviors long after you have withdrawn. This is not achieved through manipulation or artificial tactics, but through the quality of presence you bring when you do choose to engage fully. Dr. Margaret Chen, a business advisor who mastered this principle, discovered that her most powerful influence often occurred during the periods when she was not actively working with clients. After intensive engagement periods where she provided deep strategic guidance, Dr. Chen would withdraw completely, allowing her clients to implement her recommendations without her continued involvement. During these periods of absence, Dr. Chen's influence often grew rather than diminished. Clients would find themselves asking what would Dr. Chen recommend, in situations she had never directly addressed. Her perspectives would be referenced in meetings she did not attend. Her strategic frameworks would be applied to challenges that emerged after her engagement had ended. This legacy presence created what Dr. Chen called extended influence, the ability to impact outcomes and decisions long after active involvement had concluded. Clients began to understand that working with Dr. Chen was not just about receiving immediate guidance, but about internalized ways of thinking and problem-solving that would serve them long after their formal engagement had ended. The alchemy of controlled absence ultimately transforms not just how others perceive you, but how you experience your own agency and impact in the world. When you master the art of strategic withdrawal, you discover that your influence is not limited to the moments when you are actively present, but extends into the spaces you create through your absence. This transformation requires overcoming the deepest conditioning of the weak self, the belief that your worth is measured by your availability, that your influence requires your constant presence, and that withdrawal inevitably leads to irrelevance. The truth is precisely the opposite. Strategic absence amplifies your presence, selective engagement increases your influence, and controlled withdrawal positions you as unforgettable in ways that constant availability never could. The unforgettable individual emerges from this alchemical process not as someone who has learned to manipulate others through artificial scarcity, but as someone who has discovered their own intrinsic worth and learned to honor it through strategic allocation of their most precious resources, time, attention, and presence. They understand that being unforgettable is not about being constantly remembered, but about creating memories so vivid and valuable that they persist long after the immediate interaction has ended. The man who destroys his weak self through the mastery of controlled absence cannot be destroyed by others because he has learned to exist independently of external validation and constant accessibility. He has discovered that his true power lies not in what he provides continuously, but in what he offers selectively. He is transformed from someone who fears being forgotten into someone whose absence itself becomes a form of presence that others cannot ignore. In mastering the alchemy of controlled absence, we discover that the most profound transformations often occur not through addition but through subtraction, not through doing more but through choosing less, not through constant presence but through strategic absence. The weak self that believed its worth came from unlimited availability dies, and in its place emerges the unforgettable self that understands that true influence comes not from being everywhere at once, but from being exactly where you choose to be, when you choose to be there, with the full power of focused presence that only strategic absence can create. This is the ultimate secret of Machiavellian scarcity. It is not about becoming less available to others, but about becoming more available to yourself. In protecting your time, attention, and energy from those who would consume them carelessly, you create space for the deep work, clear thinking, and authentic presence that make you genuinely valuable rather than merely useful. The unforgettable individual is not remembered for being everywhere, but for being themselves completely in the moments and places they choose to appear. The destruction of the weak self through strategic scarcity is thus revealed as the ultimate creative act, the conscious cultivation of a presence so concentrated, so valuable, and so memorable that it transcends the ordinary boundaries of time and space to become truly unforgettable.